Hey there, internet friends. Trevor Starkey here with a special slash different episode of That News You Care About this week, with all of the kind of weather issues in Texas where half of our team is based. Logan is kind of continually battling with, understood power outages and whatnot. And so our thoughts, of course, go out to everybody in Texas. Our team in particular. And so as a result, I'm kind of flying solo this week for a That News You Care About episode that's going to be really only focused on one item this week. Late last week, the controversial game 6 Days in Fallujah that was canceled back in 2009, I think, has been revived, and Peter Tamte, who has been kind of the figurehead of the game in its revival, has been doing the rounds in some interviews with Polygon and GamesIndustry.biz that I'll have linked in the show notes. And he's basically just been making a big old case for why he is not the guy to make this game, let alone why this game shouldn't be made. For those that don't know, 6 Days in Fallujah, controversial originally and canceled because it was, seemingly glorifying one of the, worst travesties, I think, in modern American military history. Debate and the whole conversation. I am admittedly not the most versed on the topic, so I'm going to actually be kind of deferring to and pulling from people that are much more equipped to speak on the issue here. But obviously, the Iraq War, we got into it in America through very dishonest means, and basically destroyed countless lives as a result of just terrible decision making from the American government and our military leaders going into Iraq following the 9/11 attacks back in 2001. I will almost always remember distinctly that we invaded Iraq on my birthday in 2003. And here we are in February of 2021. We're still there all these years later, and kind of at the height, kind of the battles in Fallujah happened, and countless civilians were injured and killed as a result of just poor activities, I guess. And so, was it Konami, I think, was publishing the game back at the time. When the game got announced, it blew up and made its way even into the Fox News ecosystem and stuff, and ended up getting canceled. And yeah, recently it has been revived, and Peter Tamte, who's out there as kind of the head of the project, is out there saying things like, we're not trying to make political commentary on the game. And what's the pull quote from the GamesIndustry.biz? I don't think we need to portray the atrocities. So the concerns are immediately flaring up that this game is just going to be a glamorization of, America is best or something, despite the fact that pretty much everybody with any kind of actual insight on the matter would argue that Fallujah is a failing, not something to be celebrated in a video game or anywhere else, really. And so I have my own larger thoughts just on Tamta's kind of views as a whole. Like, you can't. Any game about war is political in nature. Pretty much any piece of art is political in nature, and I'm so tired of people like him, people like Ubisoft reps repeatedly argue that like the Tom Clancy games aren't political. They're not trying to make political games. When Far Cry 5, was touting this very religious extremist American in, was it Minnesota or Montana or something? Montana, They basically tried to have their cake and eat it too, where they were using clearly political and iconic imagery, but saying stuff like, "Oh, we're not trying to make a political game. We're our game is apolitical." I want to say Deus Ex, Mankind Divided pulled the same kind of stuff where they were clearly drawing from Black Lives Matter movements, early Black Lives Matter stuff, and activity like that. But then they would come out and say, "No, we're not making a political game. That's up to the player to decide," and it's bullshit. You are making political games. I pulled out like Tom Clancy himself was a very political figure that a week after 9/11 was out there on the O'Reilly Factor on Fox News arguing that America was attacked because leftist politicians had weakened, our responses to stuff like that. So even the use of Tom Clancy's name as a brand at Ubisoft with their, bevy of Tom Clancy games is a political act. And pretending otherwise is just appealing to the lowest common denominator, which in this case is the keep your politics out of video games crowd, because those people are fucking morons. Politics exists in video games. Politics exists in any art form. And trying to pull them out because it's not politics you like is just stupid. Like, I would rather this guy come clean and say, like, yeah, we're making a game to kind of glamorize the military, potentially because military recruitment is down and they're trying to use gaming to, flare it back up or something like that. It's one theory that often gets thrown around with these kinds of stories. I would rather like somebody be honest about that, and then I can just hate the game for that. But anytime somebody comes out and says we're not trying to be political, fuck you. Like, that is even worse, in my opinion. So those are really my big picture thoughts on the story as a whole. Is like it as I tweeted out when I kind of quote tweeted the Polygon article the other day. If you're not trying to make a game that is a political commentary and you're making 6 Days in Fallujah, you're making the wrong fucking game. Jackass, I think is what I called him. And yeah, so I want to really take the opportunity in this episode to kind of highlight a couple different perspectives that I'm going to be pulling from their kind of Twitter feeds. One is John Phipps, aka at Mr. Megative on Twitter. One of the smartest and most insightful guys I know on this matter. With firsthand experience, he fought in Fallujah as he's a former U.S. Marine. So I want to kind of pull up his thread on when the game was originally announced last week. So this is prior to any of the articles that really kind of like flared up this week as of recording. This is when they announced the game through another Polygon article. Mr. Megative, aka John Phipps, aka currently on Twitter, he's going by Present Malone. Cute. But he had this to say. Okay, I've organized my thoughts about the revival of 6 Days in Fallujah. I want to approach this through the lens of someone who was in Fallujah during 2004-2005, during some of the worst urban combat U.S. forces have ever experienced. Let's get a few things out of the way. The invasion of Iraq was a war crime, period. Argue otherwise and I'll block you. Does this make myself and others who fought war criminals? No, of course not. Did individual soldiers and Marines commit war crimes? Absolutely. I'm someone who is deeply proud of my service. I tried my hardest to conduct myself as humanely as possible. I'm also someone who is forced to do things I'm not proud of to survive. Taking lives should never be a point of pride. Iraq was a failure of our own making. Not only did we invade illegally, we did it without a plan. The vast majority of the insurgency were disaffected Iraqi soldiers without a job after we broke apart the military, not religious fanatics. Yes, groups like AQI showed up to fight, but they came after we handed them a major propaganda victory by showing up in the first place and turning PMCs like Blackwater loose. There was little to no cultural sensitivity training. Many Marines and soldiers turned the honorific title Haji into a term used to describe insurgents and criminals. I'll be bluntly honest with you, I did it too. I was a different person back then. I was a kid. We made strings of promises to innocent Iraqi civilians to get them to work for us as interpreters and sources. We plied them promises of U.S. citizenship. We broke most of those promises. I've spoken of this before. Ultimately, we were the bad guys in many scenarios. Ultimately, we were the bad guys in many scenarios there. If that upsets you, good. It upsets me. There are justifications for war, but there are never good reasons for one. We did not have a justification for Iraq. That makes us a hostile occupier. Which brings us to 6 Days in Fallujah. This was originally billed as a third-person survival horror game about one soldier trying to get out of Fallujah. It promised to depict OIF as it actually was, a horror story. I was apprehensive but intrigued. Of course, it was shelved, and now 11 years later, it's back as a tactical first-person shooter with the specter of the DoD behind it, which really worries me. U.S. Army recruitment is at an all-time low, which is one hell of a coincidence. From America's Army to America's esports, the military had a proven track record of using games as recruitment tools. The people behind this new iteration of the game promise to depict the, quote, true experience of soldiers. Marines... sorry. Let me start again. That one. The people behind this new iteration of the game promise to depict the quote-unquote true experience of soldiers, Marines, and Iraqi civilians. But does anyone actually believe that? I don't. That trailer was nothing like the original concept of what's been promised since. It's just more flag-waving. Americans as liberators nonsense. I'm sure the game will regale us with tales of noble sacrifice and grateful Iraqi citizens, when really it should depict frightened kids fighting in a war they don't fully understand, private contractors looking for slaughter, and dead Iraqi children. That's not to say there weren't acts of compassion, sacrifice, and heroism by U.S. troops. Of course there were. I've seen some. The majority of those there were decent men and women who didn't really want to be there at all. But if you really want an accurate experience, you'll depict the outstanding courage and fortitude of the Iraqi people who worked with us, fought with us, and died with us because of us. They deserved much, much better than we gave them. We still haven't apologized. Now, do I think it's possible to do this the right way? I really do. Do I trust the devs to do it the right way? Absolutely not. I'm already pretty confident about the end result. Understand this. Every American failure, every one, is born of a lack of foresight, of not thinking about the consequences. There's no better example than that of the U.S., the Soviet Union, and Afghanistan in 1989. After Congressman Charlie Wilson had very rightfully persuaded Congress and multiple other nations to provide billions of dollars in arms to the Mujahideen to repel the murderous Soviet army, CIA case officer Gust Avracados was on the balcony with Charlie. Gust asked Wilson if he knew the story about the Zen Master. Charlie said no, and Gust told the story. The Zen Master observes the people of his village celebrating a young boy's new horse as a gift, and they say, "Oh, how wonderful." The Zen Master says, "We'll see." When the boy falls off the horse and breaks a leg, everyone says, "Oh, how terrible, the horse was accursed." "We'll see," says the Zen Master. Then war breaks out, and all the young men go off to fight except for the boy, who can't because of his injury. Everyone now thinks the horse is a gift again, and they say, "Oh, how wonderful." The Zen Master says, "We'll see." Do you understand? So that was a thread, again, from Mr. Megative that I wanted to highlight that came out before all of the Peter Tamta stuff, which is really just enforced pretty much everything he was concerned about there, that this game is not going to be handled appropriately, despite Tamta saying, repeatedly in these articles, "Oh, we've talked to people, and that what did he say? The vast majority of the concerns he's heard seem to be from people that weren't there," and so he effectively dismisses them, which is atrocious. He continues to kind of make excuses for why he's making this game and brush off the idea that it is a political in nature. But anyway, so I wanted to highlight John's thoughts on the matter there. Originally, I was hoping we'd be able to get him on the show, but his schedule didn't line up and allow for it. So the other perspective I really want to showcase and highlight here, kind of pulling directly off of the Polygon article released on Monday of this week, the interview, is that of Rami Ishmael, Netherlands and Egyptian game developer, prominent game developer in the community. He does a ton of consulting work as well as kind of being a developer on his own. At tha_Rami, and he is a person of Arab descent, and repeatedly kind of talks about his trials, especially like in travel, as a game developer and travel, as a result of that, the presumed lists he's on, and all the woes that he has faced, encountering all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to pull in his perspective as well as a prominent kind of Arab member of the community, Islamic member of the community, I suppose. So he quotes, "Okay, we're going to go through this and explain why it sucks." Pulling from a part of the Polygon article and highlighting, in an interview with Polygon on Thursday after the game was announced for a second time, Tampty was insistent that developer Highwire Games will not grapple with the political machinations that led to their titular conflict. Rami quotes that saying, "War is political machinations. That's the entire thing about war. It's politics that leads to people killing each other. The entire point is political gain or the diminishment of the other party's political power. In the case of Iraq, it was neither. The U.S. made up a reason." Pulling the very next quote of the Polygon article, "Instead, their first-person shooter will try to engender empathy for American troops in the field for their work destroying the insurgents that dug in throughout Fallujah, and for the civilians trapped in between." Rami says, "Engender sympathy for U.S. troops? Question mark. Excuse the fuck me? When you look up the casualty statistics for the Iraq War, you'll find the U.S. deaths, but you could barely find Iraqi victims, civilians, or resistance, or insurgent, or terrorist. They're all defined terrorist or collateral." He further quotes, "For us as a team, it is really about helping players understand the complexity of urban combat. It's about the experience of that individual that is now there because of political decisions." Rami says, "How about the experiences of that individual that was just living there, and they and their kids and husband tried to flee, but men of military age were refused escape from the besieged city by the U.S. before the U.S. went door to door and killed anyone that looked at them wrong." I think he meant to say that looked at them wrong. Quoting the article again. "And we do want to show how choices that were made by policymakers affect the choices that a Marine needs to make on the battlefield, just as that Marine cannot second-guess the choices by the policymakers." Rami says, "This is literally the least interesting part of the entire conflict. Between kill and be killed, people tend to opt to kill. We can play that in Doom. We can play that in Quake. If you leave out the context of knowing the war is wrong, you might as well not make this." The second part of that quote of, just as that Marine cannot second guess the choices by policymakers, we're not trying to make a political commentary about whether or not the war itself was a good or bad idea, which again, kind of the crux of the pull quote, that kind of kicked off this Polygon article, really making waves yesterday as a recording. Rami says to that, "What the fucking fuck are you talking about? What political statement is there in making up false pretenses to bomb the fuck out of a country, killing hundreds and thousands of innocent people over a decade is bad? How the fuck can you fail even the most basic humanity test?" And then he basically says, "How the fuck was that just the opening paragraph?" So Rami continues on. It is a long, extensive thread that I realize now as I'm starting to do it, would be me reading this for another probably half hour alone or something like that. So but it is perhaps the most important perspective on this, as a game developer of that region, who has seen oftentimes firsthand the prejudices that are faced from American forces, from American just America first mentality, that I wanted to highlight him. I will include the full thread, his kind of full response in in the show notes on this. But yeah, it's 6 Days in Fallujah just is a clusterfuck of a game and continues to prove that it is completely irrelevant to existence. It should not, and at this point, most likely will not again. It'll probably get canceled again, I imagine, unless Tamta is that dug in. If the DoD really does get behind it with funding and that kind of stuff, maybe it'll come to light. But this game is doomed to fail, and by clearly the accounts I think we've seen coming out in the last week, it will add nothing to video game discourse, nothing worthwhile to the video game discourse and conversation. So it's just trying to kind of paint over atrocities committed in wartime, and shouldn't get a pass for it. So I think it is rightfully getting reprimanded and taken to task this week, and we'll see kind of where things continue from there. I will also, I don't have it pulled up here for me, but I will also include, because I saw it making the rounds as well, Daniel Ahmed, who is another video game analyst who covers a lot of activity, specifically in the Asian markets, in China in particular. But he also had a great thread on kind of the futility and stupid nature of 6 Days in Fallujah coming back. So I will also try and incorporate and include that in the show notes as well. So I highly encourage anybody listening to seek out any and all of those Twitter threads, because I think they're all far more important to the conversation than anything I can provide. Again, my outrage as a complete outsider, as the prototypical white American male that is not negatively impacted at all by any of this stuff, would be that the turning a blind eye to the political nature of art is irresponsible and cowardly. Somebody kind of responded to me in my original tweet of like, well, maybe they have a different vision for what constitutes political commentary, and I said no, like it's inherently political, and pretending otherwise is irresponsible and a terrible act of cowardice, and it again is really only appealing to those people who are the dregs of the Twitterverse that argue keep your politics out of gaming and that kind of stuff. So fuck those people. Fuck Peter Tamte. And I mean, like, I'm not gonna say fuck all the devs who are making this game, but I would question why they are, and why they're not. Yeah, I would question why they're making this game. Like why they would stand by and defend it. Hopefully it's not just, well, it's a job kind of thing, because this is just seems like a terrible project from all accounts. So yeah, 6 Days in Fallujah. Quote, not trying to make a political commentary, but making clearly a political commentary. So that's going to do it, I think, for this episode. I don't have any particular shout-outs. We'll maybe bring some back when hopefully we return to a normal episode next week. Hopefully everything clears up in Texas. Again, best wishes to everybody out there affected. And yeah, hopefully we can get Logan back on the show next week. But again, check out all these threads in the description for this episode, because I think it's important context that clearly Tamta is not interested in providing, because he's a coward. So yeah, that's going to do it for this episode of That News You Care About. I've been your host, Trevor Starkey. You can follow me at Trevor J. Starkey on Twitter. You can follow all of the work we do over at That Nerdy Site. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite. Like, subscribe, share the podcast with your friends, all that stuff. And yeah, I think that's going to do it. I didn't bother pulling in kind of the typical show notes pages, so really just been winging this whole episode. But as always, stay nerdy and be good to each other.